Hi gang, it's me, E.H. Ivins, and this is another edition of The Radical Reset. Today we're going to talk about primarily cryptocurrency, but before we get into cryptocurrency and how you can invest in cryptocurrency, and by that today I'm going to mean primarily Bitcoin. I realize that there's Ethereum and there's other cryptocurrencies, there's a long list of cryptocurrencies, but for today's purpose, in order to hedge your bets, in order to be prepared for what's about to come, I'm going to dwell on Bitcoin because it is by far the most accepted cryptocurrency and almost unique, and it's the only one you can really spend in a lot of different places, not to mention easily convert, not to mention trading on futures exchanges. And I'm going to cover all of that as we get involved in the discussion today. But before I get there, I've said before, and I'm going to say it here now, and I'm going to try to make the case for you. The reason Donald Trump was elected president is because we all know there's something terribly wrong, but most of us can't put our fingers on it. And I'm going to try to put my finger on it for you right now. When I was a kid, and I'm 62 years old, when I was a kid in the 1960s, if your dad made $20,000 a year, you were not just middle class, you were very upper middle class. And we were upper middle class. My stepfather made about $20,000 a year. We lived in a house that was a 3-story stone Tudor house in a suburb of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania called Mount Lebanon, which in those days, and I think still is, fairly exclusive. We went to the best schools. We had great vacations. I went to Europe. We went to Canada all the time. We went to Florida every year. My mother stayed home. She raised the children while my stepfather went to work, and we had a full-time housekeeper. And still plenty of money left over to drive Cadillacs and belong to the Rolling Hills Country Club. Now, I say all that because that was on $20,000 a year, which is below the poverty level. And what happened, and the reason, all of us have been raised to believe that inflation is part of the equation. In other words, we should expect inflation, but that wasn't always true. It wasn't true until 1971 when Richard Nixon, God bless him, and I mean that completely facetiously, abrogated, which meant canceled, the Bretton Woods Agreement. Now, the Bretton Woods Agreement was a deal made after World War II in 1948 under the presidency of Harry Truman to put the world on a gold and silver standard that backed up the dollar, and then the dollar would back up all the other world currencies. So in other words, the dollar became the basket currency, the supporting currency of every other currency in the world. And I won't go through that whole list. There's many more currencies than there are e-currencies, but you know what I'm talking about, francs and lira and pesos and rubles and yada, 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 yada. Okay, everybody held dollars, and the dollars were backed up by the gold and silver held in Fort Knox. Fort Knox still exists. It's in Kentucky, and if you ever want to get a little nostalgic about that, watch the old James Bond film Goldfinger. Okay, it's about robbing Fort Knox. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. So Richard Nixon, traditionally governments had to make a decision throughout most of history whether they were going to spend money on guns or butter. In other words, you could fight a war or you could have social programs, but you can't do both. So in other words, when Franklin Roosevelt instituted the New Deal during the Great Depression, when World War II started, all the New Deal programs came to an end. The CCC, the WPA, and if you don't know what any of those initials mean, it's not important. They're gone now. They had to be canceled because we had to fight World War II. When World War II was over, we started social spending again. But then came Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society and the Vietnam War. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on history. There's a great book out now, pardon me for itching myself. There's a great book out now by Amity Shlaes on Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society, and you can read that on your own. She also wrote a great book on the Great Depression as well. That's Amity Shlaes, and I am not compensated by Amity Shlaes or her publisher in any way, shape, or form. I just thought they were great books. Anyway, you can then understand a little bit of the history. But Lyndon Johnson thought he was going to transform America in a way that no other president thought of before, even Franklin Roosevelt. And he's the president that took over after John F. Kennedy was shot. And he passed in his first 90 days in office more legislation than John F. Kennedy passed in 3 years before he died. And Lyndon Johnson was probably, almost inarguably, the most, what's the right adjective, prolific president in American history. He passed an enormous amount of legislation. He had been the majority leader of the Senate before he became the vice president, later the president. He knew how Washington worked, and he passed a lot of legislation. He's the one who passed the Civil Rights Act. He's the one who passed Medicare and Medicaid. And most of the social programs, AFDC, Aid to Family with Dependent Children, and other things like that, almost everything that we think of as government programs, or at least the base supportive entitlement to government programs, were first enacted by Lyndon Johnson. Now, at the same time, we were fighting a major land war in Asia called the Vietnam War, which for my generation is very present, but for most of you watching that are millennials and Gen X's and Gen Zers, probably it's just ancient history. But it was a big deal when I was a kid because over 50,000 Americans died in the Vietnam War. It was unbelievably expensive, and we tried to wage the war and conduct the Great Society programs at the same time. Richard Nixon, who succeeded Lyndon Johnson, tried to do the same thing, and by 1971, and this is before Watergate and before he was removed, by 1971 he realized he could not do both, and rather than make a decision about, for example, ending the goddamn war in Vietnam, pardon me, but I felt very strongly about it then, I feel very strongly about it now, he decided to do both at the same time and therefore abrogate the Bretton Woods Agreement, end it, and then start printing up dollars out of thin air. And then almost instantly, we got inflation. And inflation got pretty bad. So Richard Nixon tried wage and price controls, and then he was removed from office. Gerald Ford, the man who succeeded him, was a hapless president, and he tried whip inflation now buttons. I know that sounds positively quaint. In other words, he tried to get us to voluntarily stop raising prices. But inflation became part of the picture. And not only did it become part of the picture, but it became part of the Federal Reserve's program, and we were all groomed to expect that inflation was something that we should accept, that is part of a healthy economy, which is absolutely not true, but it's what the government would like us to believe. Now, this brings me around to why there's something wrong that all of us know. So, $1 in 1971, to have the same amount of spending power today, you would need $6.79. That means, that for that same $20,000 income that supported my family, myself, my sister, my stepfather, my mother, in luxury in the suburbs of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, driving Cadillacs belonging to the country club and going to Europe, in order to do all that, today you would need a minimum, just to, in the same dollar structure, and I don't even think this would be enough, but you'd need about $135,000, $140,000 just to spend exactly the same way. Now, the average income in the United States today is $50,000 a year, roughly. I'm talking about private employees that don't work for the government. Government employees make more than private employees. On an average, they make about $74,000 a year on average, which is a scandal, but that's a subject for another podcast. In this podcast, let's just go with those of us, most of us, who are working for private companies, large companies, small companies, for ourselves, professionals, lawyers, engineers. The average income of the average American who doesn't work for the government is $50,000 a year. That means that if husband and wife work together, forget having a full-time housekeeper, forget mom staying at home raising the kids, forget being able to belong to the country club, forget being able to drive Cadillacs, or the modern equivalent thereof. Cadillac's still a great car, but there's plenty of other great cars as well. If I were going to buy a great car today, I'd probably buy a Toyota Avalon, because I can't see why I'd buy the Lexus sticker for exactly the same car. I'd rather just tape the extra $20,000, $30,000 on the hood, but I digress. Anyway, to do all those things, you need more than both mom and dad's incomes combined if they earn the average $50,000 a year. And that is why we all know something is wrong. Because even with mom and dad working, even then, you can't earn as much and have as much spending power and live as good a life as you did not very long ago on $20,000 a year. And that's what inflation does. It's been a quiet... Now, why did the government intentionally cause inflation? The government intentionally causes inflation because that's how they plan to handle the national debt. They have no intention of paying off the $22 trillion, and by the time you watch this, and with all the new stimulus programs that are going on with the COVID-19 virus, it could easily start approaching 25, 28, 30 trillion before you know it. The idea is to cheapen the money so that when we go to pay it off years later, $1 trillion sounds like $1 billion, just like we've made $1 billion sound like $1 million. When I was a kid, you were really rich if you had $1 million, and the richest man in the world was John D. Rockefeller, and he was worth about $250 million. There were no billionaires when I was a kid. And today, we are lousy with billionaires. It's not that they're any richer than John D. Rockefeller was. In fact, in many ways, they're not as rich. But we've made a billion seem like $1 million, and we've cheapened the currency to such an extent that it's much easier to become a billionaire. So, what does that mean? That means that even with husband and wife working, you can't make as much as my stepfather did. And he, by the way, was not a doctor or a lawyer or an Indian chief. He was a produce broker at the produce yards on Smallman Street in Pittsburgh. In other words, just another working guy, and was making a really nice living. And most of the guys that lived in the neighborhood in Mount Lebanon in those days were all engineers with Westinghouse. We were one of the very few families that weren't a wasn't a Westinghouse family. And anyway, the rest is history. Now, you got to get mom and dad and probably one of the kids to start working part-time to have the same lifestyle, or even full-time to have the same lifestyle. And that means, and the only reason it seems so bad now is that it's all been covered up by the feminist movement. Now, I mean this in a good way. I am a feminist. I believe in equal opportunity for women, equal work for equal pay. Do not jump on my case when I say that. But the expectation when I was a kid, for better or for worse, and I'm not going to get into a social commentary in this podcast, but when I was a kid, the expectation was women stayed home and raised the children. Today, the expectation, and largely because of the feminist movement, is to have value. At least initially, a woman should come out of school, whether it's high school or college, and have a career and a profession, and continue to expect to work while she's married. It's the expectation. And that change in expectations, and again, this is not social commentary, but that has largely covered up the drop in buying power of the dollar, because we have naturally combined the family to mean two incomes, not just one income. It is not uncommon for mom to earn more than dad anymore, which is fine. I don't care. I am a feminist. I'm all about women's rights. But with those changing expectations, we covered up the breakdown of the buying power of the dollar. But unless we adopt polygamy, we're going to run out of parents to earn enough money to keep up with the loss of buying power of the dollar, and that's why people feel they're falling further behind. And that's, by the way, also why we get bubbles in the investment market. We get bubbles because people are being forced to invest their money into things they don't understand or know anything about. So there's been a real estate bubble. Now we're having another real estate bubble, and we get stock market bubbles, and there's .com bubbles, and all those bubbles are driven by millions of Americans knowing that they have to invest money but not really knowing where to invest. So like a herd of cattle, they invest all in the same thing, which sooner or later leads to a bubble. But if the dollar was retaining its value, if the dollar could be counted on to be worth $1 in spending power, a year from now, you might just put your money in the bank where it's nice and safe, because you know it's still going to spend the same. But we all know that a year from now, and 2 years from now, and 10 years from now, the dollar's not going to spend the same. So we all know that we have to take risk, and we all know we have to invest. Now, that's the setup to where we are now. And if you argue with me, I don't think you're in a position to argue. I think that you're going to be wrong. I'm going to be very, very blunt. This is what's going on. This is why all of us know something's wrong. And both parties are complicit. Let's not get political about this. The Democrats spend money on social programs. The Republicans spend money on the military-industrial complex. They all deal with their cronies. That's what anti-politism is all about. That's why it's democracy by selection, not election. But until we have an anti-politics government, we have to deal with the one that we have. And the one that we have has put us in a terrible and perilous situation. And I believe coming out of this COVID crisis, as I spoke to in an earlier video podcast and on my audio podcast as well, the link of which is, in fact, just below this video as you're watching this, and you can listen to a longer explanation of COVIDnomics. They put us in a position where we're going to have to deal with, when we come out of the COVID-19 crisis, probably a recovery followed by a complete collapse, because we've put too much money into circulation. I could get into that in greater detail, but I'm not going to. Again, listen to COVIDnomics. It's the audio podcast that's on the Radical Reset audio podcast you can listen to. You've got lots of time on your hands. You're stuck at home anyway. Okay, so here we are. So what are you going to do to hedge your bets? Well, in my personal opinion, you've got to start investing money in precious metals, namely gold, and in Bitcoin. Now, why those two things? Because they don't correlate with the stock market or the real estate market. You need to have non-correlating assets. Correlating means in the stock market, if the stock market goes up or down 100 points or 1,000 points, almost all stocks or all stocks go up or down based on the move of the market. In other words, they all correlate. The way to understand that is that all ships rise and fall with the tide. And you don't want an investment that correlates with that. You want an investment that benefits from a collapse in the stock market or the real estate market, or both, which I think is what's coming. And precious metals are where people traditionally run to because we just accept that gold is the storehouse of value. It has rarity. Prices are set by rarity, my friends. The reason that gold is more valuable than silver is because gold is much harder to mine and find than silver. Silver is a precious metal, but it's not going to ever be as valuable as gold because there's so much more of it. Plus, the industrial uses of silver have become less and less. Its primary industrial use was photographic film, and since nobody uses film anymore to film anything, its primary use has gone away. So really gold, in my opinion, and platinum and palladium to a lesser extent, but listen, don't complicate your life. Let's just think about gold. Gold's the way to go. And the way to buy gold, by the way, is not to buy it on TV from the various companies like Roslyn Capital that advertise it, because they have to pay for all those ads, which causes for a tremendous charge against your gold assets when you first begin. Some of the prospectuses I've read go as high as 34 and 35% up front, which is a big hill to climb just to get even. Instead, if you're going to buy the physical asset of gold, you go down to your local coin dealer, you pay about a 3% commission, and you take the gold home. Make sure you get a floor safe, bury it in the concrete of your of the floor of your house, so that a thief can't dig it out, and lock the gold up. Now, the problem with that is that if anyone finds out that you have gold in your house, you could have a gun to your head to unlock the safe. And secondly, you probably have to keep guns in the house to protect your gold. And in my personal opinion, it leads to more complications than it's worth. Never use, by the way, a safe deposit box, because the government can lock safe deposit box, and the government has confiscated gold before. During the presidency of, I believe it was Franklin Roosevelt, gold was in fact called in and confiscated by the government. Don't put your gold where the government can get it. The second place that you might want to consider buying gold, and I think is the more practical, is to buy gold through the exchanges, either using a precious metals mutual fund or the GLD exchange traded fund that you can buy and hold in an account. And I'm not so paranoid as to worry about that, and it just seems simpler to me, and it eliminates the risk of me. But again, I understand both sides of the argument. Either buy the metal directly through coins or bullion, or buy it through certificates, which basically violates the concept that I said, don't let the government confiscate your gold, although I think that's a real big long shot in the modern day. So really, whatever suits your purpose. Listen, let me just tell you, everyone has their own degree of paranoia. Whatever yours is, do what makes you comfortable. But that brings me to Bitcoin. Now, why are the cryptocurrencies the acceptable storehouse these days for those of us who don't trust the government and don't trust the value of the dollar, and for those of us who buy into what I'm saying? The reason is, number one, they have scarcity. In other words, Bitcoin and all cryptocurrencies that I'm aware of are mined using algorithms. Now, by mined, it doesn't mean that there's a little hole in the ground where there's a bunch of Bitcoin miners, like little seven dwarves chomping into the rocks and getting the Bitcoin. I mean, there are computers that spend all day long mining using an algorithm, which is a fancy word for a method that's set to get the Bitcoin out of the internet. And there's a limited amount of Bitcoin as was programmed by its developer, who no one really knows who that was, but was probably a dead Japanese scientist / engineer who has gone but set up the algorithm, and there's a limited supply of Bitcoin. That limited supply, coupled with the demand for it, is what creates Bitcoin's value. Now, there are two more reasons that Bitcoin is the most acceptable e-currency against all the others, besides the two things I mentioned. It can only be mined by an algorithm, and there's only a certain amount of Bitcoin, and it's widely accepted. The other points are that it can be used to spend money. There are places to spend Bitcoin now. I'm not going to go through them, but you can simply Google it up, and you'll find lots of companies that accept Bitcoin. And secondly, and this is the most important thing to understand, is that Bitcoin is being traded on many futures exchanges around the world. Now, futures exchanges, brief explanation of futures, and I'll get through it, or some people call it the commodities market, but it's really a futures market, is you're betting on the future price. And futures markets exist to provide price stability. One of the knocks against Bitcoin up to this point is that it came out at a penny and went to $14,000 and then has fluctuated wildly ever since. As I'm talking to you today, it's trading at about $7,300 to $7,400 for a Bitcoin. And you buy them fractionally. You don't have to buy a whole Bitcoin. You can use, and I'll get into what I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but you can use a Bitcoin wallet to purchase fractional Bitcoins. But anyway, if you buy a whole Bitcoin today, it trades at about $7,400. Anyway, but it's had wild fluctuations. And for a lot of people, that's terrifying. I mean, there's two kinds of risk. There's principal risk, means will your money go to zero? And there's volatility risk, which is the wild gyrations that takes place, or what's called market risk during that period of time. And if it's too wild for a lot of people, it's too too frightening and they can't invest in it. So I'm going to tell you right now, if you are going to be frightened by gyrations, don't buy e-currency. I myself see I believe in buying low and selling high. So if Bitcoin went today from 7,400 down to 3,800, which it was a month ago, okay, when COVID first came out, I would unhesitatingly invest more to buy more Bitcoin. To me, that's Bitcoin on sale. It would be as if I was looking at a $1,000 suit in a department store and suddenly I saw it on sale for $500 and I really wanted that suit. I would buy that $500 suit because I would perceive that I was getting $1,000 in value for $500. So when I see Bitcoin at half of what its price is today, if that were to happen, I would get all the cash together I possibly could, because it's my perception that that's too cheap. I think Bitcoin will go 20, 30, 40, 50,000, maybe even $100,000 ultimately or more for a Bitcoin before the dollar collapse comes and we have to completely reorder the way our society operates. Now, but again, that's another subject for another day. But Bitcoin is wildly volatile. But now that it's trading on the futures markets, that volatility is being lessened and will continue to lessen because futures markets exist to reduce price volatility. Now, what do I mean? Okay, by the way, my background is finance. That's what I did for a living for over 30 years. So I want to explain to you how futures markets work briefly and why they reduce price volatility. You can, in a futures market, you don't bet on things going up or going down, you just bet on them moving. Up or down doesn't matter. That's called puts and calls. Puts is a bet on the down, calls are a bet on the up. There are two kinds of players in a futures, and the futures markets are nothing more than a big insurance market. In other words, let's use the example of automobile insurance. You and I both drive a car, and we all buy car insurance, and we would buy it whether the government required it or not. I realize that every state has a requirement to have automobile insurance, but you'd buy it anyway because it's a large asset, and in case someone hit it, you want to hedge your bets. That's what this is all about. It's hedging. You own a car. You're driving it on the street. You know there's a risk of an accident. The risk of you getting your car totaled is about 1 in 5,000 approximately. You pay a premium each year to the insurance company. The insurance company says that if you do total the car, they'll replace the car. I realize they say they'll do more than that, but this is just a brief, simple discussion. So just bear with me. They'll buy you a new car. Okay, that's how all insurance works. Health insurance covers big health bills, life insurance if you die, and the premium that you pay is all based on risk. Now, in the futures markets, it's the same thing. There are two kinds of players, hedgers and speculators. Hedgers are the guys that own whatever it is they're trying to protect. Speculators are the insurance company. They don't own it, but they're willing to take a bet and pay off if things go against you. Okay? So, let me explain. And let me use the example of General Mills and Cheerios because it's going to be easy to understand. Cheerios are made from oats. And so General Mills, which is an enormous company every year, has to project its budgets based on what they think they're going to pay for oats. But oats are an agricultural product, and oats go up or down depending on the weather. Now, there are two players in this game, the farmer and General Mills. Now, the farmer owns the oats, and the farmer wants to make sure that he's protected on the downside, and General Mills wants to be protected on the upside. In other words, General Mills is going to be a speculator and the farmer is going to be the hedger. The farmer is going to make bets on his oat crop that if the price of oats go down, okay, he's going to be able to win his bets when he bet against the price of oats, in other words, puts, get the money back from that he lost on his crop and therefore be able to plant a new crop, pay off his bank loans and operate next year. On the other hand, General Mills, who is speculating, is going to speculate on the upside, okay, and bet in the other direction from the farmer, so that if the price of oats go up, General Mills wins those bets, so the higher price they have to pay for oats offsets the increased cost they would have otherwise to make Cheerios, which is why you and I, as the consumer of Cheerios, 6 months from now, are going to spend the same thing for a box of Cheerios that we do today, regardless of how much it rains out in oat country and whether the farmer is up or down and whether General Mills pays more or less. Get it? That's all that the futures markets are. You can play futures bets on anything, including currencies. So all the world's governments are playing, and plenty of individuals, there are futures markets for currencies, for any currency you can imagine, but the dollar is the big player. And when you see the price of the dollar each day, when you go into the Wall Street Journal, you go online to wherever it is that you look, and you see what's a dollar trading for versus a yen, that's all based on futures prices and how the dollar's trading on the futures markets. And that's why the dollar is pretty stable, and that's why most major currencies are pretty stable, because they're being traded on the futures markets. Now, nothing's a perfect guarantee, and the dollar can and will collapse, but we've discussed that before. And again, listen to the COVIDnomics audio podcast and you'll understand that better. But anyway, for the sake of this example, Bitcoin is now being traded on futures exchanges. This is going to reduce the volatility of Bitcoin, and it's going to make it less terrifying to invest. So the point of the matter is, now I know, by the way, the point of the matter is it's becoming an accepted place to invest. Now I know that there are lots of negative articles about Bitcoin, but who's writing those negative articles are mainstream economists and government officials, okay, who say those things about Bitcoin. The mainstream economists write about it because they don't understand it. Look, economics is not a science, it's an art. And it's not like physics where, it's math and it's provable results and the theory of relativity is true because it's been proven and so on and so forth, okay? It's a soft science, if you even want to call it a science. And everyone's got an opinion. Opinions are like assholes, everybody has one, and mainstream economists are simply not going to like e-currencies because they really don't understand them. Governments hate e-currencies. They hate e-currencies because you can trade e-currencies back and forth and never pay taxes on what you earn because the government doesn't see what you earn because those transactions are part of what's called the blockchain, and the blockchain is unhackable. The government simply will never know what you have in Bitcoin. It's totally protected, which is, by the way, a risk, and I'll explain that in just a minute. I'm sorry I keep itching myself, but my mustache is just itchy today. Don't know why. But anyway, so they're going to hate it because they can't tax it. Although some governments are starting to accept it, even some state governments in the United States, I believe, don't quote me on this, check it out. I think California is now accepting Bitcoin at least partially as payment for California taxes, but they're so desperate for money they'll accept anything. But the point of the matter is that basically Bitcoin and the government don't mix. Plus, criminals use Bitcoin. I can tell you that the drug lords that I knew in prison routinely transacted their business in Bitcoin for the same reasons. It can't be tracked. Now, and as Bitcoin is increasingly spendable, it means that there's less and less need to launder money since they can spend their Bitcoin that nobody can track, and that really fucks with the minds of governments. But fuck the government. Who gives a shit what they like and they don't like? The fact of the matter is you can't make Bitcoin illegal any more than you can make breathing air illegal. There's no way to regulate it. There's no way to track it. And if they made it illegal tomorrow, they could pass a law, but all they do is create a lot of criminals because no one with Bitcoin is going to turn it in. And there's no way for the government to find out. It's just absolutely positively secure. That's why Bitcoin is it's so widely accepted. That's why you need to own it. That's what protects you. Now, how do you buy Bitcoin? I myself use a service called Coinbase, Coinbase. I am not compensated and have no connection whatsoever in any way with Coinbase. I use it because it's easy. And every single month, I take a percentage of my money and I put half of it into precious metals and half of it into Bitcoin. That's how I invest my money day to day. And so far, year to date, for example, my Bitcoin overall is up 38.9%. Is your stock account up as much as my Bitcoin? By the way, I'm not selling Bitcoin. I'm not going to sell Bitcoin. I'm not here to transact Bitcoin with you. I have no conflict of interest. You do what you want, but I use Coinbase. There are plenty of other platforms to buy Bitcoin. Now, Coinbase attaches to a wallet. That wallet is a super secret place to put your Bitcoin. And by the way, they trade every cryptocurrency. If you want to trade Ethereum or Libra, well, Libra isn't even out yet, but all the other cryptocurrencies, you can trade them all on Coinbase and then use the Coinbase wallet to put it away. Here's the catch. It's so secret that if you lose your password and you lose your access and you lose your security code and you forget what they are, any part of this, you're fucked. You lose your Bitcoin. You lose all your e-currencies. There's no way to recover it. You can't have one of these things where you put down it's in your computer saved on the cloud, and if you don't have it, it'll recover it, and you can always recover your password. And text us and we'll text you a message and blah, blah, blah. That doesn't work with Bitcoin. If you forget your password and your access code and you lose your access, you've lost your Bitcoins forever. They are unrecoverable. The security on Bitcoin and all e-currencies are absolute. And if you're saying to yourself right now, well, that's not a big deal. I use the same password, blah, blah, blah. It's super hard to break. I have a great password. I'll never forget it. I'm going to use it. Look, you might get Alzheimer's disease, and then your kids are fucked. Look, don't be stupid. Find a place that no one's ever going to look and write it down somewhere, the old-fashioned way, and put it away where the sun doesn't ever shine. If they can hide $3.5 million of drugs a year in the Kingman prison of the state of Arizona, believe me, that's how much drugs are going through there each year. You can find a place to write down your Bitcoin or your wallet access and password so that you don't lose it forever, and so that you're, and tell someone that you absolutely trust, you know, among your children or your spouse or someone you absolutely trust, where you hide that thing, so that if you're killed or if you lose your mind and, you know, end up like Joe Biden with onset of dementia, Joe, if you own Bitcoin, if I were you, I'd write it down, because a blind man could see you are losing your cookies. Anyway, you want to vote for Joe, go ahead, but I'd pay a lot of attention to who his vice president's going to be. Anyway, having said all those things, that's the catch with Bitcoin. It's so secret that you can lose your access to it, so be very, very careful. But the point of the matter is, if you want to protect yourself, it's the best way to protect yourself, because in a dollar collapse, the Bitcoin is going to become unbelievably valuable. And the reason I split it up 50-50 between gold and Bitcoin is I like to not put all my eggs in one basket. You know, there's an old saying that says, never put your eggs all in one basket. So I do it 50-50. Now, am I buying stocks now? No, because I think we're buying high to sell low. Am I buying real estate now? No, I think you're buying high to sell low. You want to buy low and sell high. The cryptocurrencies are cheap. Gold is cheap. Inflation is here. All these dollars they're pumping into circulation is going to cause a problem that's going to make the Great Depression of the 20th century look like a happy walk in the park. And that is the end of my advice for today. Now, make sure you click the subscribe button here so that you become part of my family, and I can reach out to you with new episodes. So you also want to click on the notification button. Pick up a copy of A Radical Reset. It is free to you on the Amazon site if you're a Prime member to read electronically, or you can buy the paperback version. The Terrarium, my novel, and the Grand Mastermind novels, which are just entertainment, are both out, also on Amazon under the exact same terms. Don't forget to listen to the audio podcast, because I go a lot longer, because I don't want to spend too much time doing video, because really, how long can you stare at my mug? I myself can't even stare at my mug as long as these things go on, barely, so there you go. And that's it. I wish you the happiest of days. Until next time, this is E.H. Ivins, signing off.